Matt Smoke with Project Ontario. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
It's good to be on with you, Colin.
So, give me a larger sense here of how some conservatives, especially those with the Project Ontario movement, are feeling about this moment. It seems like Premier Doug Ford has really hit a bit of a polling low, according to Angus Reid, 21%. I'm wondering where your kin are at with Premier Doug Ford right now.
I mean, I think some of this is entirely predictable. Not only what we were talking about a year ago, but also just looking at the ebbs and flows of governments in other jurisdictions. Where you start off riding a wave of popularity. You've got a popular leader. You've got a lot of I'd say the benefit of the doubt behind you, and at some point. 8 years in, maybe that point is people start looking at their lives and asking very fundamental questions about are the things that I expect my government to deliver to me improving my life or not? And do I have evidence of that? And I think, three majority elections in, coming up on a decade in office, there's just a mounting amount of evidence that suggests that we're making the wrong decisions as a province, as a government. Naturally, there are bigger macro considerations. We're not blind to the fact that we're in a trade war with the United States. There are some sort of national level decisions that impact not only Ontario, but other parts of the country. But it's always worth remembering that Ontario is a massive determinant of the prosperity of the country. We represent about 40% of the people in Canada. And if we make decisions differently, we have the ability to either move the country with us or hold the country back. And I feel like the concern is that we've been, on average, holding the country back over the last several years from meeting our potential and sort of achieving the prosperity that Ontarians expect.
Where do you guys think the gaps lie? I mean, the government says that they're focused solely on, protecting Ontario, that mandate that they ran on in 2025, and that includes taking a lot of trips to the US to kind of sell the Ontario economy, get as much investment here as possible. For 2 straight months, as an example, the premier points to the fact that they've had, pretty significant job increases to the total of about 80,000 jobs added back to the economy. I mean, isn't that proof point that something of what they're doing is actually working and it's moving in a positive direction? Where are the gaps in your view?
I worry that the metrics that we use to measure whether or not our economic policies are working are superficial. I think of job numbers as one that governments like to point to, but they don't really speak to the quality of the jobs or the underlying performance of the economy that creates and generates those jobs. I mean, this has become a theme across the country, but Ontario is no different. We have an economic policy that generally looks a lot like corporate subsidies handed out to favored industries, as opposed to broad-based reforms that would just make the country and the province more competitive. So it's one thing to say that the government can step in tough times to make sure that hard-hit industries in the midst of a trade war are not bearing the brunt of the entirety of the negative consequences, let's say, the steel industry, the auto industry, et cetera. But if you want to set up the province for long-term competitiveness, I think we need to look at broader reforms. And I don't think that we've seen much movement on that front. I remember hearing a statistic from members of this cabinet saying, hey, when the Liberals were in power, they almost doubled the amount of red tape that might apply to small businesses and businesses in the province. And since we've taken office, we've reduced red tape by 6%. And it just sort of feels like the order of magnitude of the underlying issues that are really holding our economy down are not being addressed with enough seriousness. And I think that's where you'd see a lot of conservatives looking for more of a reform-minded agenda, saying we've tested this approach, it's not bearing fruit. When right now, you look at the federal narrative around, are we in a recession? Are we in a technical recession? Are the numbers sort of off? One way or another, whether we're seeing our economy shrink by 0.1% or we're seeing our economy grow by 0.1%, these are not great numbers to be proud of for any level of government. And I think we need to find a path back to like real growth, real prosperity, and it's going to require some different decisions than we've been making.
So chances are you guys would like the progressive conservatives to stay in power, but do you feel like you can get to that point that you're looking for and Project Ontario is looking for with the current premier still in charge?
This has never been about a challenge to his leadership. I think this has been about wanting to highlight that there are members of that political movement that see the world differently than this government. Naturally, at 8 years coming into a fourth election, there's going to be natural questions, not just from us, but from members of his team, members of his cabinet, ex-members of his cabinet that I think would be looking for opportunities to think about renewing the leadership. I think that day will come, not because of Project Ontario, but just because it's the natural order of things. And I think, the challenge that we put to the party, because I do think, to your question, I do think the PC party is the right vehicle for the types of changes and reforms that we're talking about. But there's going to be a moment in the not so distant future where the PC party's having to make a decision of, hey, what direction do we want to go? What type of leader do we want to elect? And there's going to be some leaders that represent maybe status quo, more of the same agenda, more of the same governing philosophy. And there's going to be some that put their name forward that are looking for a change of direction. And I think of, a very obvious corollary would be what we saw happen to the federal Liberals when Justin Trudeau left and Mark Carney stepped into the role. You could not have imagined a more stark change of governing philosophy between those two leaders in a governing party that was having a hard time in the polls, and then you come out of a Mark Carney election, and now they're doing incredibly well, and the country's on a different track. I don't agree with everything that the Carney government is doing, but from a Liberal perspective, they are very much undoing many of the policies that his predecessor put in place and trying a different economic strategy. I think we're going to need to figure out our version of that in Ontario for the PC party as well.
Right. So that, I mean, essentially means that you feel like we've arrived at that moment. After 8 years, perhaps this is the closest that it seems like the PC party has come to renewal. Do you think that moment
I,
has
I, I think
arrived?
that's right. I think that's right. But I'll say with the context that we're in a majority government, right? Like, I think there's, polls can ebb and flow, popularity can ebb and flow. There's lots of outside factors. I think the premier is, very confident in his role. I don't think that he's going to be the first to buckle under pressure, and I think he could hold off another election until 2030 if he wants to. So there's lots of time to see what happens. There is a scenario where the premier starts to realize that, hey, if I want to have a chance of sort of rekindling some of the support and enthusiasm from my base, I might need to look at things differently. I might need to go back to some of the first principles that got us elected in the first place. But there's a very real possibility that we're not having a real conversation about change until 2.5 or 3 years from now, just because of the timing of a majority government. So I do think the cards are in the premier's hands. I hope they will listen to voices that are asking for a change of direction. And if not, I think we're going to continue seeing headlines like what we saw over the weekend, headlines talking about his personal popularity, headlines speculating about who might be the next leader to replace him. And I don't think that that's going to end just because he doesn't want to pay attention to it.
Can I ask about some of those headlines? As I had a conversation with Daryl Bricker with Ipsos yesterday, who made a good point that there's quite a divide between what we're seeing with the premier's personal popularity at 21%, according to Angus Reid, and the party's own internal numbers and other pollsters, which put the PC party support at roughly about 41%. What do you make of those two numbers? They seem to really offer a bit of a contrast. The government, led by Doug Ford, could win another majority if there was an election today, but Doug Ford's personal popularity seems to be at an all-time low. How do you reconcile those two numbers?
Two things that come to mind. I mean, on the one hand, we've got the Ontario Liberal Party in the midst of a leadership race, and I think it's hard for them to really define themselves until they decide who will be the leader to carry them into the next election. And I think when that day comes, we will see a lot more activity coming out of the Liberals that will maybe chip away at that. And I don't want to preclude on who's going to be the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party when all is said and done. But you take a candidate like Navdeep Bains, who has a meaningful amount of profile, a meaningful amount of financial support. I think it's not inconceivable to see the Ontario Liberal Party come out of a leadership race with a lot of momentum and enthusiasm, and people willing to maybe take a second look at a party that they gave up on 10 years ago. I don't think that that's the solution to the problems that we're facing as a province, but it is something that we can't take for granted, that just because the Ontario Liberals have been sort of in disarray, we've benefited from a natural majority number in the 40s in almost every poll looking back over the last several years. But when you look at the premier's personal popularity, it also tells a very different story, which means to me, the province is a lot more convinced that a PC government should be in office than they are convinced that this is the leader to lead them. And I think that is something that the party needs to reflect on and the premier needs to reflect on, because you can either push that to one conclusion where you push the patience of the voters until the point where they punish you at the polls, or you start looking at, you start listening to feedback and either changing course or making room for somebody else who will change course. I don't think that that decision needs to be made in 2026, but we're definitely seeing evidence that that pressure is going to start mounting. And my sense is the premier is going to have to make one of those two decisions: change course, make room for somebody else to change course, or face voters that are unhappy by the time they have another option to vote for.
Right, and we're starting to see a little bit of that, right? What did you guys make of what we saw at Ford Fest? And not just Ford Fest, the fact that, there were protesters that infiltrated and really took over, drowned out the premier. And this was an event that he should have been flipping burgers and meeting with all of his constituents and supporters. But instead, the scenes we saw were, heavily armed
Yeah.
police forces kind of protecting the premier from the very people who he always professed to be very much in touch with. And you add to that then the bizarre changing of colors of protesters and photoshopping images. Is that indicative of a government that's winning the narrative of the day?
I mean, I'll separate two thoughts on Fort Fest specifically. I don't think the existence of protesters at a PC party event is all that noteworthy. I think you will always find people, particularly public sector unions, that have some gripe with the PC party, that could show up at an event. I think what's more noteworthy is that the sheer number of people that were there to protest versus enthusiastic supporters that were there to lend their support maybe was the bigger story. I think what this party has seen over the last year or two, and we saw these similar headlines when it was time for their convention earlier this year, that there was worries that they just couldn't pull the grassroots enthusiasm that they once had. When you go at the riding level and you look at the ability for them to turn out crowds for purely partisan political events, I think they're struggling to motivate their base, because I don't think that the base feels very well listened to or engaged at this point. And so when you have an event that doesn't have enough supporters, it sort of leaves a lot of room for a lot of opponents and protesters to take over the event. What happened with that photo and whether or not it was photoshopped, I mean, I'm not one to say. It does seem, though, like we're finding ourselves in a position where the party is more often than not defending itself and trying to make it seem like they are still popular when maybe the evidence is pointing to the contrary. And so if you're not getting the support you need from your supporters, you need to start asking why. What would motivate my supporters to show up in large numbers and be enthusiastic again about the agenda that we're pushing?
Okay, and I just wanted to end with, returning to the idea of whether the premier could face a challenge outside or internally. You're saying that Project Ontario isn't necessarily, driving any kind of movement to take out the premier or replace the premier, right?
Nothing explicit. I will say, like, transparently, there's a lot of people in the world of conservative politics having a lot of conversations. And naturally, headlines, when they make the news, they spur a lot of conversation. So when you see a headline in the Toronto Star indicating, hey, here are the names of potential candidates, I mean, it's going to naturally lead to people whispering and questioning and wondering if this is the right time. My sense is that the timing is really not in the control of anybody other than the premier himself. And you can't really do anything to change that, just given the nature of a majority government. I will say that when I looked at that article in the Toronto Star, and you look at the names that pop up as potential would-be future leaders of the PC party, there's a lot of names in there that are not all that different than the premier. They're either existing cabinet members or recently departed cabinet members or former leaders like the mayor of Brampton. Like, these are not out of the box new paradigm thinkers. So I worry that if the party does make a decision to go down this path and start questioning what's next, that they need to think a little bit differently than just picking somebody from the same cast of characters that have been involved along the way as we've seen the province continue down this managed decline path. So I'd be cautious to say, hey, the candidates that might be contenders in the future are maybe not the ones that are obvious today. It's worth noting that there's a whole bunch of talent in the federal conservative benches that are just watching to see what happens provincially, as well as, members of the PC party itself. So, I think there's a lot to be seen. I don't think that list of names that we saw in the Toronto Star article is the list that will become, part of the conversation when the time comes.
But ultimately, the chatter that you're hearing in those conservative circles, is that real? Is that an organizational level? Has it reached that point just yet, or is this just
Not that I've seen. Not that I've seen, and I'll say, there's two things that are happening sort of in parallel. I mean, on the one hand, I think there's some conversations happening about the need to be prepared should the premier make a decision prematurely or unexpectedly that nobody's really anticipating. If the premier comes out of the summer and says, you know what, I just want to retire, there'd be a big rush and vacuum to figure out, hey, how do you get organized to start thinking about a leadership race? I think that's a very low likelihood outcome, but it's something worth having in the back of people's minds so that there's some contingency planning happening in that direction. I think realistically, most people are expecting that there's still a couple of years before this becomes a real substantive conversation. I don't think we're going to see the type of organization we saw, let's say, in the last couple of cycles for the federal Conservative Party. Again, that party was in opposition, and when leaders lost elections, like Andrew Scheer and Aaron O'Toole, there was a natural impetus to have actual organization to push them out. When you're talking about a sitting premier with a majority mandate, the dynamics are very different. So yeah, I think it's more a matter of being prepared for any possible eventuality, knowing that those things are more in his hands than anybody else's.
Okay, Matt spoke with Project Ontario. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Colin.